You co-wrote a book precisely on this topic, The Long Shadow of Antiquity. What have the Greeks and Romans done for us? What are some key elements of antiquity that are reflected in the modern world?
Yeah, it's a book that my wife and I wrote together, and it is trying to make people understand how deeply rooted our current actions in almost every way, even things that we think are just truly unique parts of our culture, or things that we think are just innate to human nature, are actually rooted in the past. So there's another power of the past thing. And this is just a long, specific list of examples, really. So, I mean, we go through government and education and intellectual stuff and art and architecture and, a lot of things we've been talking about today. Language, culture, medicine, but even things like, habits, the way we celebrate things, the way we get married. Our marriage rituals have all sorts of things in common with Roman weddings.
The calendar.
The words. We're using Julius Caesar's calendar. I mean, Pope Gregory did one tiny little twist, but Caesar's the one who basically came up with our current calendar with 365 days, 12 months, leap years, all that. So we're living in law. There's just no way to escape the power of the past. And what I believe very ardently is that you can't make good decisions in the present, and you can't make good decisions about the future without understanding the past. And that's not just true with your own life, but it's in understanding others. So it's not only your own past you have to understand, but you have to understand other people, what's influencing them. So you can't interact with others unless you understand where they're coming from. And the answer to where they're coming from is where they came from, and what shaped them and what forces affect them. So I think it's absolutely vital to have some understanding of the past in order to make competent decisions in the present.
What are some of the problems when we try to gain lessons from history and look back? We've spoken about them a bit, the bias of the historian. Maybe what are the problems in studying history and how do we avoid them?
Probably the biggest problems are the sources themselves, the incompleteness of them. And this gets more intense the farther back we go in time.
Yes.
So if you say, I want to write a book about the 19th century, there is more material available for almost any topic you want to pick than you could possibly go through in your lifetime. If you say, I want to write a book about the Roman world, this is a very different thing. In my office, I have a bookshelf that's, 8 feet high, 10 feet wide, and it contains pretty much all the main surviving Greek and Roman literary texts. Mm-hmm. Okay, one bookshelf.
Wow.
It's a big bookshelf.
Yeah.
But that's what we use to interpret this world. Now, there's a lot of other types of text. There's, papyri. There's all sorts of things. There are inscriptions. There's archaeological evidence. So there's other stuff. But honestly, 99% of things about the world I study are lost. So then you get into all the issues is what we have surviving a representative example? We know it's not. For example, all the literary texts are written by one tiny group, elite males. Mm-hmm. So that's a problem there. There's the problem of bias. We know that they're not necessarily telling us the truth. They have an agenda. They're representing history in a certain way to achieve certain things. Then there's the problem of transmission. I mean, all those texts are copies of copies of copies of copies. And everybody knows that game where, you whisper a sentence to someone and then go around the room. Are you going to get that same sentence back? Well, every ancient text we have has gone through that process. So this is a real problem. And that's just with the sources, right? And this is the historic era. When you move back just a little earlier to the prehistoric era or to civilizations that don't have written sources surviving, and some of these are ancient Mediterranean ones, I mean, anything goes. One of the jokes is that museums, archaeological museums, are full of objects which are labeled cult object. It's some religious object. And I think the honest label that should be on that thing is, we have no idea what the hell this is. But I want to believe it's something important, so I'm going to say it's a religious object. But in reality, it's an ancient toilet paper roll holder or something. Yeah. And it's a huge problem when you try to interpret a civilization without written texts. And my favorite little story that kind of illustrates this is in the 19th century, this German who had gone to school in England, okay, one of the best educated guys of his time, goes to North Africa and is poking around in the desert. And he finds this site with these huge stone monoliths, 10 feet tall in pairs. And there's a lintel stone across the top. So sort of like big, two posts with a stone across the top. And there's a big stone in front of them too. And so he looks at this stuff and he says, well, what does this remind me of? It reminds me of Stonehenge, right? And there's even a site where there's multiple of these kind of in a square. So he goes back and talks about this, and an Englishman goes and studies them, and he finds a ton of these sites, and he finds some of them where there's 17 of these pairs. And so he goes back and he writes a whole book about how clearly the Celtic peoples who once lived in Britain came originally from North Africa, because he's found this site, and he reconstructs the religion where obviously they practice religious rituals here, and they had rites of passage, they squeeze between the things, and the altar stones have this basin, so they had blood sacrifice and all this. And it seemed reasonable. And then, you ask some locals, well, what's that stuff out in the desert there? And they mean, oh, the old Roman olive oil factory? And those are the remains of an olive press. And we're back to olives. I keep dwelling on olives. Olives don't grow in England or Germany.
Yeah.
So this is cultural bias.
Yeah.
If all you have is physical evidence, you're going to interpret that evidence through your own cultural biases. So if you're an Englishman and you see big stone uprights like this, you're going to think Stonehenge. If you're from the Mediterranean, you're going to think olive press. So that's a salutary example, I think, of the dangers of interpreting physical evidence when you don't have written evidence to go along with it. And, think today, like if our civilization were to blow up in a nuclear war and archaeologists were to dig this up, how might they misinterpret things? I mean, if they were to, dig up a college dorm, like where I work, and that's what you had for this civilization, you'd probably go in the dorm rooms, you'd find all these little rooms, and maybe in every room you'd find this mysterious plastic disc. And so everybody has these, so it must be a cult object, and it's round, so obviously they're sun worshippers. And if you can decipher the inscription, you'll see that obviously they all worship the great sun god Whammo.
Yeah.
It's like, what do you find in every dorm room? A Frisbee.
Yeah.
So that's the level of interpretation you have to be aware of. And there's examples where we've done exactly this.
So we'll have to have intellectual humility when we look back into the past. But hopefully, if you have that without coming up with really strong narratives, if you look at a large variety of evidence, you can start to construct a picture that somewhat rhymes with the truth.
Yes. I mean, that's, as a professional historian, that's what you do. You attempt to reconstruct an image of the past that is faithful to the evidence you have, as filtered through what you can perceive of both the biases and the problems of the source material and your own biases. And it's a interpretation. It's a reconstruction. But it's a lot like science, where you're in a process of constantly reevaluating it and saying, okay, here's some new evidence. How do I work this into the picture? How do I now adjust it? And that's what's fun. I mean, it's a mystery. It's you're being a detective and trying to reconstruct and to understand a society. And it's even more fun where you have to try to empathize. Empathy is a great human thing, to empathize with people who are not yourself. And we should do this all the time with just the people we encounter, but this is what we're doing with ancient civilizations. And as I talked about earlier, sometimes you'll feel great sympathy there. Sometimes you'll feel incomprehension. But by being aware of both of those, you can maybe begin to get some grasp, however tentative, on the truth as you might perceive it.
To ask a ridiculous question, when our time, you and I, we together, become ancient history, when historians, let's say 2, 3, 4,000 years from now, look back at our time and like you try to look at the details and reconstruct from that the big picture of what was going on, what do you think they'll say?
I would guess it'll be something that's actually more of a commentary on whatever's going on at that point than on the reality of us, because that's what we tend to do.
Yeah.
I'll tell you what I'd like to have them say is to say, in this civilization, I can detect progress, that they have advanced in some way, whether kind of in moral terms or in self-awareness, or have learned from what's come before. I mean, that's all you can try and do, is do a little bit better than whatever came before you, to look back at what happened and try to do something. Livy, I mean, one of the great Roman historians, the beginning of his work, A History of Rome, which is this massive thing, he says, the utility and the purpose of history is this: it provides you an infinite variety of experiences and models, noble things to imitate and shameful things to avoid. And I think he's right.
And they would perhaps be better at highlighting which shameful things we started avoiding and which noble things we started imitating. With the perspective of history, they'll be able to identify, or maybe with the bias of the historians of the time. Well, in that grand perspective, what gives you hope about our future as a humanity, as a civilization?
We have curiosity. I think curiosity is a great thing, that you want to learn something new. I think the human impulse to want to learn new stuff is one of our best characteristics. And at least up to this point, what makes us special is the ability to store up an accumulation of knowledge and to pass that knowledge on to the next generation. I mean, that's really all we are. We're the accumulation of the knowledge of infinite generations that have come before us. And everything we do is based on that. Otherwise, we'd all just be starting, at ground zero, kind of just from the beginning. So our ability to store up knowledge and pass it on, I think, is our special power as human beings. And I think our curiosity is what keeps us going forward.
I agree. And for that, I thank you for being one of the most wonderful examples of that, of you yourself being a curious being and emanating that throughout and inspiring a lot of other people to be curious by being out there in the world and teaching. So thank you for that. And thank you for talking today.
No, enjoyed it. It's fun. I obviously like talking about this stuff.